The crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed across the dusty yard like a gunshot, final and unforgiving. Sammy's heart hammered against his ribs as Bull Hawkins stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow what remained of the McCready family's hope. The man's yellowed teeth gleamed in a predatory grin as he counted out 4 quarters, dropping each coin into the auctioneer's palm with deliberate slowness. "Pleasure doing business," Hawkins drawled, his voice like gravel grinding underfoot. His cold eyes swept over Sammy's father. "Course, if you'd taken my offer on the West 40 last month, Tom might not have come to this." Tom McCready's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sammy had seen that same look on his father's face when the bankmen came calling, a mixture of pride and desperation that made him appear smaller somehow, worn thin as an old work shirt. Moonwhisper nickered softly as Hawkins' hired hands approached with thick ropes. The stallion's intelligent dark eyes found Sammy through the crowd, and the boy felt something tear inside his chest. Those eyes held no fear, only a quiet trust that made everything worse. The horse didn't understand betrayal, didn't know that sometimes good people had to do terrible things just to survive another day. "Easy now, you worthless flea bag," muttered Jake Cutler, one of Hawkins' men, as he slipped the lead rope around Moonwhisper's neck. The stallion shied away from his rough handling, hooves dancing nervously in the dirt. Sammy's hands clenched into fists. Moonwhisper wasn't worthless. He was the finest horse in 3 counties, with bloodlines that traced back to the great racing stables of Kentucky. Grandfather McCready had won him in a poker game from a railroad baron, back when such things were possible, back when their family name meant something more than unpaid debts and broken promises. "Come on, son." His mother's voice was barely a whisper as her trembling hand found his shoulder. "Nothing more we can do here." But there was something more. There had to be. Grandfather's words echoed in Sammy's memory like a half-remembered song, "The white horse carries more than his rider, boy. When the darkest hour comes, look to what rides closest to his heart." At the time, Sammy had thought it was just another of the old man's rambling stories about the war and the wild days that followed. Grandfather had been full of such tales, some true, some embellished, all told with the gleam of adventure in his fading eyes. But as Sammy watched Hawkins' men loading Moonwhisper into their trailer, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, one of those stories might hold a grain of truth. The crowd was dispersing now, folks heading back to their own struggles with the quiet resignation that had settled over Millfield like dust over everything else. Mrs. Patterson from the general store nodded sympathetically as she passed, but her eyes held that particular mixture of pity and relief that came from watching someone else's misfortune, relief that it wasn't her family standing in the ruins today. Tom McCready. Bull Hawkins appeared beside them like a storm cloud, his presence making the air feel thick and dangerous. "I'm sorry it came to this. Truly I am." The lie rolled off his tongue smooth as honey, but Sammy caught the satisfaction lurking beneath the false sympathy. Hawkins wasn't sorry at all. If anything, he looked like a man who'd just won a hand of poker with cards he'd dealt himself. "You got what you came for, Bull," Tom said quietly. "No need for speeches." "Now, don't be like that." Hawkins adjusted his hat, a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and threatening. "I'm not your enemy here. Times are hard for all of us, but I'm still willing to talk about that land deal, especially the section down by Willow Creek. Might help you catch up on some of those bank payments." Sammy's father said nothing, but his mother's grip tightened on Sammy's shoulder. Everyone knew what lay beneath Willow Creek, good water, the kind that didn't dry up even in drought years like this one. It was the only thing keeping their farm from turning into the same dust bowl that had claimed half their neighbors. "Think about it," Hawkins continued, tipping his hat to Sammy's mother with mock courtesy. "Doors always open." As the man walked away, his boots raising small clouds of dust, Sammy felt something crystallize inside him, not quite a plan, but the seed of one. Grandfather's stories suddenly seemed less like fantasies and more like blueprints. The old man had always said that sometimes a boy had to become a man overnight. especially when the grown-ups forgot how to fight. The trailer carrying Moon Whisper rumbled to life, black smoke coughing from its exhaust pipe. Through the slats, Sammy caught one last glimpse of white hide and knowing eyes before the vehicle pulled away, carrying more than just a horse toward an uncertain future. As his family walked back to their dusty truck in silence, Sammy was already planning his return. The ride home passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the wheeze of their old Ford's struggling engine and the occasional rattle of loose bolts on washboard roads. Sammy pressed his face to the passenger window, watching the familiar landmarks blur past, the twisted oak where he'd first learned to rope, the abandoned Garrett homestead with its caved-in roof, the creek bed that hadn't held water in 18 months. Each mile stretched between him and Moon Whisper like a physical ache. His mother sat rigid in the middle seat, her work-worn hands folded in her lap with the kind of stillness that came from holding too much inside. His father gripped the steering wheel like it might escape, knuckles white against sun-darkened skin. Neither spoke, but Sammy could feel their shared weight of defeat pressing down like the August heat. When they finally turned up the long drive to the McCready farm, the place looked smaller somehow, as if losing Moon Whisper had diminished everything else. The farmhouse squatted low and weathered beneath the merciless sun, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled like dying leaves. The barn door hung crooked on broken hinges, another repair they couldn't afford. Beyond the house, their remaining livestock clustered in whatever shade they could find. 3 dairy cows, a handful of chickens, and old Bess, the plough horse whose best days were 20 years behind her. "Sammy," his father's voice cracked like leather left too long in the sun. "Chores won't do themselves." It was the first thing anyone had said since leaving town, and the normalcy of it felt like a slap. How could they talk about chores when Moon Whisper was gone, when everything that mattered had just been sold for the price of a church dinner? But Sammy climbed down from the truck without protest. Arguing wouldn't bring Moon Whisper back, and his parents carried enough burdens without adding his anger to the load. He'd learned that lesson 2 summers ago when the bank first started sending letters, when raised voices and slammed doors had only made everything worse. The chicken coop needed mucking, same as always. The birds scattered and complained as Sammy worked, their indignant squawking a sharp contrast to the gentle nickers that should have been coming from the horse stalls. He tried not to look toward the barn, where Moon Whisper's empty stall waited like an open wound. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of familiar tasks: scatter feed, check water troughs, repair the loose board on the henhouse door using bent nails straightened and re-straightened so many times they barely held. Each chore was a small act of defiance against the chaos threatening to tear his world apart. When he finally couldn't avoid it anymore, Sammy walked to the barn. Moon Whisper's stall still held the horse's scent, sweet hay and warm hide and something indefinably wild that no amount of domestication could quite tame. The boy stood there breathing it in, his chest tight with unshed tears. "He's gone, isn't he?" Sammy turned to find his little sister Lucy in the doorway, her 7-year-old frame silhouetted against the dying light. She clutched her corn-husk doll against her chest, the one their mother had made last Christmas from scraps and hope. "Yeah," Sammy said, "he's gone." Lucy nodded with the grave acceptance children learned quickly in hard times. "Mama's crying in the kitchen. She thinks I can't tell, but her eyes are all red." That knowledge settled in Sammy's stomach like a stone. His mother never cried where anyone could see. She was the one who found solutions when problems seemed impossible, who somehow stretched every dollar until it covered $2 worth of need. If she was crying, things were worse than he'd imagined. "Will we have to leave?" Lucy asked. "Like the Thompsons did." The Thompson farm sat empty now, windows boarded up and fields returning to weeds. They'd given up last spring, packed what they could carry, and headed west with stories of work in California citrus groves. Nobody had heard from them since. "No," Sammy said, though he wasn't sure how he could make such a promise. "We're not leaving." Lucy studied his face with eyes too old for her years. "How do you know?" "Because grandfather's stories might not all be stories. Because sometimes boys had to become men overnight. Because Moonwhisper carried more than his rider, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something worth fighting for. I just know, he said instead. After Lucy wandered back to the house, Sammy lingered in the barn until full darkness fell. Through the open door, he could see the yellow glow of lamplight in the kitchen windows, could imagine his parents sitting at the scarred wooden table, adding and re-adding numbers that never came out right no matter how many times they tried. Somewhere across town, Moonwhisper stood in a strange stall, probably wondering why his boy hadn't come to brush him down and whisper the day's secrets into his patient ears. Sammy touched the leather pouch hanging around his neck. Grandfather's compass, the only thing of value he owned. Tomorrow would bring more chores, more worried conversations cut short when he entered the room, more careful rationing of everything from lamp oil to hope. But tonight, in the darkness that hid so many things, a plan began to take shape. The plan might have remained just wishful thinking if not for what happened 3 days later. Sammy was mending fence along the eastern boundary when he spotted the rider approaching from town. Even from a distance, he recognized the purposeful gait of Doc Patterson's bay mare and the slouched shoulders of young Billy Garrett astride her. Billy had been running messages for folks since his own family lost their farm, earning nickels where he could find them. "Sammy!" Billy called out as he drew near, dust rising from his horse's hooves. "Got something for your pa. Where's he at?" Checking the well pump. Sammy set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his forehead. The August sun felt like a weight pressing down on everything, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. "What kind of something?" Billy reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a crisp white envelope, the kind that usually brought bad news. From the bank. Mr. Henley said it was urgent. Sammy's stomach clenched. 3 days since the auction, and already another blow was falling. He took the envelope, noting how Billy avoided his eyes. Everyone in town knew the M-Creddies were circling the drain. "Thanks, Billy." Sammy fumbled in his pocket for a coin but came up empty. "Sorry, I don't have—" "Don't worry about it." Billy was already turning his horse around. "Times like these, we all gotta help where we can." As Billy rode away, Sammy stared at the envelope in his hands. His name wasn't on it, but he could feel the weight of whatever lay inside pressing against his chest like a stone. Bad news never got better by waiting, but it didn't get worse by waiting either, and right now every minute of not knowing felt precious. He found his father lying half under the well pump, wrench in hand, cursing at rusted bolts that hadn't budged in years. The man's shirt was soaked with sweat and streaked with rust-colored stains. "Pa," Sammy's voice came out smaller than intended. "Hand me that oil can, would you? This confounded thing seized up tighter than—" His father's words died as he noticed the envelope. He slid out from under the pump slowly, like a man trying to delay the inevitable. "Billy Garrett been by?" "Yes, sir." His father wiped his hands on an already filthy rag before taking the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open, such a small thing, but Sammy noticed everything these days, cataloguing each sign of his parents' growing desperation. As his father read, his face went ashen beneath the sunburn and grime. The letter fluttered from his fingers like a dying bird. "What is it, Pa?" "Foreclosure notice." The words came out flat, emotionless. 60 days to bring the mortgage current, or— He gestured helplessly at the farm around them. All of it, gone. 60 days. Sammy's mind raced, trying to calculate impossible math, even if they sold everything they owned. The remaining livestock, the furniture, his mother's wedding ring, they'd barely scratched the surface of what they owed. "There's got to be something we can do," Sammy said. "Maybe if we talked to Mr. Henley, explained about the drought." "You think we haven't tried?" His father's voice cracked with exhaustion. "Banks don't care about drought, son. They care about payments, and we haven't made a full payment in 8 months. He picked up the letter and stared at it again, as if the words might have changed. "Henley suggested we take Bull Hawkins's offer on the water rights. Said it might buy us some time." "No." The word exploded from Sammy's chest before he could stop it. "Pa, you can't. Grandfather always said." "Your grandfather's dead, boy." His father's composure finally cracked. His stories and his pride won't save this farm. The words hung between them like a physical blow. Sammy had never heard his father speak against Grandfather Mac Creedy before. The old man had been a hero in their family folklore, a Confederate veteran who'd carved this farm from raw prairie with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief that a man's word was his bond. "I'm sorry." His father's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen. "I didn't mean, Lord, what am I supposed to tell your mother? Your sister?" As his father walked toward the house with shoulders bent like an old man's, Sammy remained by the broken well pump, the foreclosure notice at his feet stirring in the hot breeze. 60 days, 2 months to find a miracle or watch everything his family had built crumble to dust. That's when Grandfather's words came back to him with startling clarity. "The white horse carries more than his rider, boy. When the darkest hour comes, look to what rides closest to his heart." Sammy touched the compass hanging around his neck and made his choice. Tonight, when the moon set and darkness swallowed the world, he would ride to Bull Hawkins' ranch. He would find Moon Whisper, and he would discover once and for all whether his grandfather's stories were truth or just the desperate fantasies of a dying old man. Either way, doing nothing was no longer an option. But as the hours crawled toward midnight, Sammy's resolve began to crumble like dried clay. He sat on his narrow bed, supposedly asleep, listening to the restless sounds of his parents' conversation drifting through the thin walls. Their voices rose and fell in hushed argument, his mother's tears, his father's bitter self-recrimination, the awful mathematics of desperation being calculated over and over with the same impossible result. "Maybe we should just take Hawkins' offer," his mother whispered. "Sell him the water rights and try to hold on to the house at least." "And then what, Margaret? We'd last another month, maybe 2. The water's the only thing keeping us alive. Without it, we're finished anyway." Sammy pulled Grandfather's compass from beneath his pillow, running his thumb over the worn brass surface. In the moonlight streaming through his window, it looked smaller than he remembered, just a piece of old metal instead of a talisman of hope. What if Grandfather's stories really were just stories? What if he snuck onto Hawkins' property only to discover that Moon Whisper was simply a horse carrying nothing more mysterious than saddle leather and broken dreams? The risks loomed larger in the darkness. Bull Hawkins wasn't known for his mercy. Everyone remembered what happened to the Peterson boy who'd been caught stealing apples from Hawkins's orchard. The beating had left him with a permanent limp and a stutter that still plagued him 3 years later. If Sammy was discovered prowling around Hawkins' ranch in the dead of night, a beating would be the least of his worries. And even if he managed to find Moon Whisper, even if by some miracle Grandfather's cryptic words held truth, what then? Was he supposed to steal his own horse back? The law wouldn't see it that way. Moon Whisper legally belonged to Hawkins now, purchased fair and square at public auction. Sammy would be nothing more than a horse thief, and horse thieves still faced serious consequences in Texas, depression or no depression. He thought of his sister Lucy, sleeping peacefully in the next room, clutching her corn-husk doll. What would happen to her if he was caught and thrown in jail? His parents already had more burdens than they could carry. How could he risk adding to their suffering based on nothing more than an old man's riddles? The floorboards creaked as his father paced the kitchen below, footsteps wearing a groove between the table and the window. Sammy had heard that same restless walking every night since the auction, his father wrestling with choices that had no good answers. The man who'd once seemed unshakable was coming apart at the seams, and Sammy's reckless actions might be the final blow that broke him completely. What if I'm wrong? The question hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. What if there's nothing hidden on Moon Whisper but my own foolish hopes? Grandfather Mac Creedy had been prone to tall tales, especially in his final years when age and whiskey had blurred the lines between memory and invention. He'd claimed to have ridden with Quantrill's raiders, to have buried treasure in 7 different states, to have won a railroad car full of gold in a poker game only to lose it again the next night. Most of his stories had contained enough verifiable truth to be plausible, but that didn't mean they were gospel. Sammy closed his eyes and tried to picture his grandfather's face during those long evenings on the front porch, when the old man would spin his yarns while whittling and spitting tobacco juice into a rusty can. Had there been something different about the White Horse story? Some extra weight in his words? Some glint of truth behind the familiar sparkle of embellishment? He couldn't be sure. Memory was a tricky thing, especially when desperation made it so tempting to believe. The compass grew warm in his palm as he gripped it tighter. Through his window, the moon hung fat and bright, making the landscape visible enough for travel, but also visible enough for discovery. Soon, it would begin its descent toward the horizon, offering the cover of darkness he needed. But darkness worked both ways. It would hide him from Hawkins' men, but it would also hide them from him. His mother's voice rose slightly. "Tom, we could write to your brother in Dallas. Maybe he could—" "No." His father's response was sharp with wounded pride. "I won't go begging to Henry." He made his feelings clear about the farm years ago. Sammy's chest tightened. His parents were running out of options, grasping at straws that grew thinner each day. The foreclosure notice sat on the kitchen table like a death sentence, counting down 60 days to the destruction of everything his family had built. But what if his desperate gamble only made things worse? What if, by morning, they'd lost not only their farm, but their youngest son as well? The compass trembled in his shaking hands as the weight of decision pressed down like summer heat, suffocating and inescapable. The compass stilled in Sammy's palm as he made his choice. He slipped from his bed with practiced silence, having learned every creaking board in the old house during countless midnight trips to the outhouse. The floorboards beneath his bare feet felt cool against the day's lingering heat, and he moved like a ghost through the darkness, guided by moonlight and desperation in equal measure. His clothes lay folded on the chair beside his bed, dark pants and a brown shirt that would blend with the shadows. As he dressed, his parents' voices continued their endless circle of worry below, but the words no longer mattered. Whatever happened tonight, he couldn't spend another day watching his family slowly die of broken hope. Grandfather's compass went around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt, where its familiar weight pressed against his heart. The brass felt warm now, as if it carried some spark of the old man's stubborn courage. Maybe the stories were true, maybe they weren't, but doing nothing was a choice too, and it led to 60 days of watching everything crumble. Sammy eased his window open, grateful for the recent rain that had swollen the wood just enough to muffle the usual squeak. The night air carried the scent of dust and dying grass, but underneath lay something else, possibility perhaps, or simply the intoxicating freedom of finally taking action after days of helpless waiting. The roof of the back porch stretched beneath his window, offering an easy path to the ground. He'd used this route before, though never for anything more serious than midnight swims in the stock tank during particularly brutal heat waves. Tonight felt different, heavier somehow, as if the darkness itself understood the weight of what he was attempting. His boots waited by the kitchen door, but retrieving them meant risking discovery. Better to go barefoot until he cleared the farmyard. The packed earth felt familiar beneath his feet, every stone and rut mapped by years of daily chores. He moved with the confidence of someone crossing his own territory, even as he prepared to leave everything familiar behind. Old Bess raised her head as he passed the corral, her eyes reflecting moonlight like twin stars. She nickered softly, a question or perhaps a farewell. Sammy paused to stroke her muzzle, wondering if he'd ever perform this simple ritual again. If his plan went wrong, if Hawkins' men caught him, this might be his last night on McCready land. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "Someone else will take care of you if I don't make it back." The words tasted bitter, but they needed saying. Lucy would see that Bess got fed and watered. His sister had their grandfather's way with animals, even if she was too young to understand what losing the farm really meant. At the barn, Sammy retrieved the tools he'd hidden earlier, a small knife, a length of rope, and the wire cutters he'd borrowed from his father's toolbox. The knife was nothing more than his grandfather's old pocket knife, worn smooth by decades of use, but it felt substantial in his palm. The rope might help him climb or secure Moonwhisper if the stallion proved skittish in strange surroundings. The wire cutters were insurance against fences and locked gates. He also took his grandfather's old cavalry saddle, the one that had hung unused in the tack room since the old man's death. It was heavier than Moonwhisper's usual saddle, built for long campaigns rather than comfort, but something told him it might prove important. If grandfather's stories held any truth, this saddle had been places and seen things that mattered. The weight of leather and metal across his shoulders felt like putting on armor. Each step away from the farmhouse carried him further from the boy he'd been and closer to whatever he was becoming. There would be no turning back once he left McCready Land, not because the distance was too great to cover, but because some choices changed you in ways that couldn't be undone. His parents' voices had grown quiet now, replaced by the soft sounds of preparation for another sleepless night. Soon his father would check the stock one final time before bed, a ritual that might bring him close enough to discover Sammy's absence. The boy quickened his pace, suddenly aware that time was his enemy as much as distance or detection. At the property line, marked by a fence his great-grandfather had built from stones cleared from the first fields, Sammy paused for one last look at home. The farmhouse squatted low and determined against the night sky, its weathered walls holding 4 generations of McCready dreams and struggles. Moonlight silvered the tin roof and cast deep shadows around the barn and outbuildings, making everything look smaller and more fragile than memory suggested. In 60 days, strangers might own all of it, but tonight it was still his to protect. Sammy turned toward the Hawkins ranch and stepped across the boundary into darkness, carrying nothing but hope and his grandfather's mysteries. Behind him lay everything he'd ever known. Ahead waited either salvation or destruction, and for the first time in days, that felt like enough. The Hawkins ranch stretched across the valley floor like a sleeping giant, its boundaries marked by barbed wire that gleamed like silver threads in the moonlight. Sammy crouched behind a cluster of mesquite trees, studying the layout with the careful attention his grandfather had taught him during their hunting expeditions. "Know your ground before you set foot on it, boy. The land will tell you its secrets if you're smart enough to listen." What the land told him now wasn't encouraging. 3 bunkhouses formed a rough triangle around the main house, each one dark but potentially full of hired hands who'd sleep light in a country where rustlers still operated. A large corral sat near the biggest barn, but even from this distance, Sammy could see it held only ordinary ranch horses. Cow ponies and workhorses, not a white Arabian stallion. Moonwhisper would be somewhere more secure, probably in the private stable behind the main house, where Hawkins kept his prize animals. That stable sat directly beneath the windows of Hawkins' bedroom. Sammy's mouth went dry as he considered the implications. Getting to Moonwhisper would mean crossing 40 yards of open ground under the direct gaze of the man who'd beaten the Peterson boy senseless for stealing apples. Bull Hawkins wasn't known for heavy sleeping or gentle responses to trespassers. A sound froze him in place, the soft scrape of boot leather against stone. Someone was moving in the darkness between the barn and the main house, a shadow among shadows that materialized into a lean figure carrying a rifle, one of Hawkins' men making rounds, patrolling the ranch boundaries like a sentry. Sammy pressed himself against the earth, feeling thorns from the mesquite bite through his shirt. The guard moved with practiced silence, eyes scanning the perimeter with the vigilance of someone who'd done this countless times before. He paused directly opposite Sammy's hiding spot, head tilted as if listening for sounds that didn't belong to the night. For 30 heartbeats that felt like 30 minutes, neither of them moved. Sammy's lungs burned from holding his breath, but he didn't dare exhale. The guard's face remained hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim, but his posture spoke of suspicion, as if something in the darkness had caught his attention. Then the wind shifted, carrying the distant lowing of cattle from the south pasture, and the guard relaxed. He spat into the dust and continued his circuit, disappearing around the corner of the largest bunkhouse. Sammy forced himself to count to 100 before moving. The smart thing would be to wait, to watch the guard's pattern for a full cycle before attempting anything. But time was working against him. Dawn would come eventually, and with it the increased activity of a working ranch. If he was going to act, it had to be soon. He left the cavalry saddle hidden in the mesquite and began working his way toward the ranch buildings, moving from shadow to shadow like his grandfather had taught him during their coyote hunts. The wire cutters felt heavy in his back pocket. The rope coiled around his shoulder seemed to catch on every twig, and his bare feet found every sharp stone in Texas. The first real obstacle came sooner than expected. A fence line ran between the mesquite grove and the ranch proper, but this wasn't the simple barbed wire of the boundary markers. This fence stood 7 feet tall, topped with wicked-looking spikes that would discourage anything short of a flying approach. Sammy studied the barrier, heart sinking. The wire cutters might work on barbed wire, but this fence was made of welded steel posts and heavy-gauge mesh, the kind of serious barrier that spoke of serious security concerns. Why would a cattle ranch need fortress-like fencing? As he searched for weak spots, a new sound made him freeze, the soft whinny of a horse, answered by another, then another. The sounds came from beyond the fence, from a series of paddocks he couldn't see from his original position. One of those voices made his breath catch, a distinctive musical note he'd know anywhere. Moon whisper. The stallion was closer than he'd expected, probably in one of the paddocks rather than the stable. That changed everything. It also raised new questions. If the horses were outside, why the fortress-like security? What was Hawkins protecting? You lost, boy. The voice came from directly behind him, calm and conversational, as if the speaker was asking about the weather. Sammy's blood turned to ice water as he realized he'd been so focused on the fence and the sound of horses that he'd forgotten the most basic rule of survival: never stop watching your back trail. He turned slowly, hands raised in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture, and found himself face to face with a grizzled man in his 50s. The stranger wore working clothes and a battered hat, but the rifle in his hands was clean and well maintained. More importantly, it was pointed directly at Sammy's chest. "I asked you a question, son." Sammy's throat felt like sandpaper as he stared down the rifle barrel. The man holding it didn't look angry, more curious than anything else, like he'd found an interesting bug under a rock. Somehow that made it worse. I was looking for my horse," Sammy managed, surprised his voice worked at all. "White stallion. He got loose from our pasture and—" "White stallion?" The man's eyebrows rose, and something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion exactly, but a sharpening of interest that made Sammy's skin crawl. "That's quite a coincidence, boy. We just acquired a white stallion ourselves. Beautiful animal." The casual tone didn't fool Sammy. This wasn't a ranch hand making friendly conversation. The way the man held his rifle, the way he'd appeared from nowhere without making a sound, the careful positioning that kept Sammy pinned against the fence, this was someone accustomed to handling problems quietly. "Might be you're looking in the wrong place," the man continued, tilting his head toward the fortress-like barrier. "This here's private property, posted all legal-like. You can read, can't you, son?" "Yes, sir." Sammy's mind raced, searching for some way out of this that didn't involve explaining why he was prowling around the Hawkins ranch at midnight with wire cutters in his pocket. "I just thought maybe—" "Name's Carlyle," the man interrupted. "I handle security for Mr. Hawkins. Part of that job involves keeping track of who comes and goes on this property, especially at night." His eyes glittered in the moonlight. "Especially young folks who might have ideas about things that don't belong to them anymore." The words hit like a physical blow. Carlyle knew exactly who Sammy was and why he was here. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a trap, carefully set and patiently sprung. "Now you got 2 choices," Carlyle continued conversationally. "You can turn around right now, walk back to your daddy's failing farm, and we'll pretend this never happened. Or—" He paused, letting the rifle barrel drift meaningfully. "We can take a walk up to the main house and discuss this with Mr. Hawkins. I'm sure he'd be real interested to hear about midnight visitors." Sammy thought of Bull Hawkins' reputation, of the Peterson boy's limp, of his family sleeping peacefully in their beds while their world crumbled around them. The smart choice was obvious: apologize, retreat, and find another way. But Moon Whisper's whinny still echoed in his ears, and somewhere beyond that intimidating fence lay the only hope his family had left. "I just want to see him," Sammy said quietly. "Just for a minute. To say goodbye proper." Something flickered across Carlyle's weathered features, surprise maybe, or recognition. For a moment, the rifle wavered. "That horse means something to you." "Everything," Sammy whispered, and the word came out broken. "He means everything." Carlyle studied him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "I had a horse once. Black mare named Shadow. Rode her through 3 states before—" He shook his head. "Point is, I understand the attachment, but understanding don't change facts, boy. That stallion belongs to Hawkins now. Legal and proper. For $1, Sammy's voice cracked with injustice. $1 lousy for a horse worth 50 times that. Life ain't fair," Carlyle said simply. "You're old enough to know that by now." The rifle hadn't moved, but something had changed in the man's posture. Sammy sensed an opportunity, fragile as spun glass, but real nonetheless. "Please," he said, "just let me see him. I won't try to take him or nothing. I need to know he's all right." Carlyle was quiet for so long that Sammy wondered if he'd pushed too hard. Then the older man sighed, a sound like wind through dry grass. "Mr. Hawkins finds out about this, we're both in for trouble," he muttered. "But I suppose there ain't no harm in looking." He gestured with the rifle toward a gap in the fence that Sammy hadn't noticed before. 5 minutes. You stay where I can see you, you don't touch nothing, and then you go home." "Understood?" Sammy nodded eagerly, hardly believing his luck. As Carlyle led him through the hidden gate, past the fortress-like barriers that had seemed impossible just moments before, he felt Grandfather's compass pressing warm against his chest. Maybe the old man's spirit was watching out for him after all. But as they approached the paddocks where Moon Whisper waited, Sammy noticed things that made his hope curdle into something darker. Too many guards for a simple cattle ranch, too much security for honest work, and in the distance, the sound of machinery running long past when decent folks should be sleeping. Whatever Bull Hawkins was protecting here, it was bigger than stolen horses and foreclosed farms, and Sammy was walking straight into the heart of it. The paddocks stretched before them like a maze of shadows and moonlight, each enclosure holding different types of horses. But it was the sight beyond them that made Sammy's blood run cold, a massive excavation site where the south pasture should have been, lit by electric lights and crawling with men operating machinery that had no business running on a cattle ranch. "Don't look at that," Carlyle said sharply, but it was too late. Sammy had already seen the conveyor belts, the sorting tables, the armed guards watching over workers who moved with the desperate efficiency of men working against their will. "What is this place?" Sammy whispered. Carlyle's grip tightened on his rifle. "Nothing a boy needs to concern himself with. Keep walking." But Sammy's feet had frozen to the spot as the full scope of what he was seeing sank in. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a mining operation, hidden behind the facade of legitimate cattle ranching. The machinery, the guards, the fortress-like security, it all made terrible sense now. And if Hawkins was running an illegal mine, then the foreclosures, the systematic destruction of local farms— "You're stealing the land," he breathed, "all of it. You're forcing families off their property so you can mine underneath." "You need to stop talking," Carlyle said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You need to see your horse and get out of here before—" "Before what? Before I tell someone?" Sammy's fear was transforming into something fiercer, more dangerous. "How many families have you destroyed? How many kids like me have lost everything so Bull Hawkins can get richer?" A new voice cut through the night air, deep and rough as gravel. "That's quite enough." Bull Hawkins himself emerged from the shadows near the main paddock, his massive frame making Carlyle look small by comparison. Even in the moonlight, his face was brutal, scarred from old fights, with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "Mr. Hawkins," Carlyle started. "The boy just wanted to see his horse. I was handling it." "By letting him see our operation?" Hawkins' voice was deceptively calm, but Sammy could hear the violence coiled beneath it. "By letting him count our guards and study our security?" Sammy's mouth went dry as dust. Whatever slim chance he'd had of walking away from this was gone. Hawkins wasn't just angry. He was calculating, measuring Sammy like a problem to be solved permanently. "The horse is over there," Hawkins said, gesturing toward a paddock 50 yards away. "Your precious Moonwhisper. Still carrying that fancy saddle your grandfather was so particular about." Sammy's heart stopped. Grandfather's saddle, the one with its hidden compartment and its terrible secret. If Hawkins knew about that. "Surprised I know about old Tom MacCready's interesting habits?" Hawkins smiled, and it was the most frightening expression Sammy had ever seen. "Your grandfather wasn't as clever as he thought. We've been waiting for someone in your family to come looking for what he hid." The world tilted around Sammy as understanding crashed over him. This had never been about Moonwhisper. The auction, the foreclosure, even his midnight rescue mission, it was all a trap carefully laid to bring him here to this moment. "You killed him," Sammy whispered. "My grandfather didn't die of a bad heart. You murdered him." "Prove it," Hawkins said simply. "Old men die all the time. Sometimes they even die before they can share family secrets with their grandsons. Very inconvenient." Sammy's hand moved instinctively to the compass beneath his shirt, and Hawkins' eyes tracked the motion with predatory interest. "What's that around your neck, boy? Something else Tom MacCready left you?" "Carlyle, take a look." But as Carlyle stepped forward, the night exploded into chaos. Moonwhisper's distinctive battle cry split the air as the stallion reared in his paddock, striking at something Sammy couldn't see. Other horses began whinnying and stamping, their panic infectious. Shouts erupted from the mining operation as workers scattered from some new disturbance. "What the hell?" Hawkins spun toward the commotion, and Sammy didn't waste the opportunity. He bolted toward Moonwhisper's paddock, his bare feet flying over the rough ground while his grandfather's compass bounced against his chest like a talisman. Behind him, Hawkins roared orders, and Carlyle cursed as pursuit began in earnest. Gunshots cracked through the night air, but whether they were aimed at him or the mysterious disturbance at the mine, Sammy couldn't tell. All that mattered was reaching Moonwhisper, whose white form shone like a beacon in the darkness ahead. The stallion saw him coming and trumpeted a greeting that carried all the joy and desperation of their reunion. But as Sammy vaulted the paddock fence and landed beside his beloved horse, he realized the true horror of his situation. He'd found Moonwhisper, uncovered Hawkins' conspiracy, and confirmed his worst fears about his grandfather's death. He'd also trapped himself in the heart of an armed camp with killers closing in from all sides, and no way out except through them. Moonwhisper's warm breath against his face felt like salvation and damnation all at once. Sammy pressed against the stallion's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of the horse that had been his whole world, while behind him the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Boots pounded across hard-packed earth. Men shouted orders, and underneath it all Bull Hawkins' voice boomed like thunder, promising violence to whoever brought the boy back alive. "Easy, boy," Sammy whispered, running his hands over Moonwhisper's flanks, checking for injuries while his mind raced for escape routes that didn't exist. The paddock fence was solid on 3 sides, and the fourth opened directly toward the ranch buildings where armed men were already spreading out in a search pattern. "We're gonna get out of this. We have to." But even as he spoke the words, Sammy knew they were lies. The disturbance at the mining operation, whatever it had been, was already dying down. In minutes, maybe seconds, every man on the ranch would be focused on finding one 12-year-old boy who'd seen too much. His hands found the saddle still strapped to Moonwhisper's back, grandfather's saddle with its hidden compartment and deadly secrets. The leather was warm under his fingers, worn smooth by decades of use, and for a moment he could almost hear his grandfather's voice. Sometimes a man's got to choose between what's smart and what's right, boy. The trick is living with whatever choice you make. There he is. The shout came from Carlyle, who'd positioned himself at the paddock gate with his rifle trained on Sammy's chest. Behind him, other armed figures emerged from the shadows, more men than any legitimate ranch would need, all of them moving with military precision. Bull Hawkins materialized beside Carlyle, his massive frame filling the gateway like a boulder blocking a stream. Nowhere to run now, boy. Why don't you come on out of there nice and peaceful? We just want to have a conversation. Sammy pressed closer to Moonwhisper, using the stallion's bulk as a shield. About what? About how you murdered my grandfather? About how you're stealing people's land for your illegal mine? Careful words from someone in your position, Hawkins said. But there was amusement in his voice now, the casual cruelty of a cat playing with a wounded mouse. You're trespassing on my property, boy. In Texas, that gives me certain rights regarding unwanted visitors. The other men chuckled at this, a sound that made Sammy's skin crawl. He'd walked into this thinking he was saving his horse, but he'd actually delivered himself to the very people who destroyed his family. The irony was bitter as poison. Course, if you cooperate, Hawkins continued, we might find a way to work this out. That compass you're wearing, hand it over, along with anything else your grandfather might have left you, and maybe we can discuss terms. What terms? Sammy's voice cracked, but he forced himself to keep talking. Every second bought him time to think, even if he couldn't see any way out. You already took everything from us. Not everything, Hawkins said meaningfully. Your family's still breathing. Your little sister still plays in that yard every morning. Your mama still hangs washing on the line every Tuesday. Be a shame if something happened to disturb that peaceful routine. The threat hit Sammy like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on saving Moonwhisper, on recovering whatever treasure grandfather had hidden, that he'd forgotten the most important thing. His actions wouldn't just affect him. If he defied Hawkins now, if he tried to fight back, it wouldn't just be his life on the line. That's right, boy, Hawkins said, reading the defeat in Sammy's expression. You're starting to understand how this works. Now why don't you— The words were cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze, the distinctive whistle of the late-night freight train that ran through Millfield twice a week. But the whistle was coming from the wrong direction, and it was too long, too insistent to be a normal signal. What the hell? One of Hawkins' men muttered. The whistle came again, closer now, and with it the sound of horses, not the panicked whinnying from the mining operation, but the thundering hoofbeats of riders approaching fast. Understanding dawned on Hawkins' scarred face. It's a raid. Someone tipped off the law. His eyes swung back to Sammy with newfound fury. You didn't come here alone, did you, boy? But Sammy was as confused as anyone. He'd told nobody about his plan, brought no help, expected no rescue. The approaching riders were as much a mystery to him as to his captors. Spread out, Hawkins roared. Positions. If it's the Texas Rangers, we— His words were drowned by gunfire erupting from the mining operation. Shouts of alarm filled the air as the mysterious riders swept into the ranch compound, their weapons blazing in the darkness. In the chaos, Sammy made his choice. He vaulted onto Moonwhisper's back, feeling the familiar comfort of the saddle beneath him even as bullets whistled overhead. But as he wheeled the stallion toward what looked like an opening in the paddock fence, he saw Bull Hawkins raising a rifle with deliberate aim, not at the attacking riders, at Moonwhisper. You want that horse so bad? Hawkins snarled. Then you can die with him. Time slowed to a crawl as Hawkins' finger tightened on the trigger. Sammy saw the muzzle flash before he heard the crack of the rifle, felt Moonwhisper's powerful muscles bunch beneath him as the stallion sensed danger. But instead of the searing pain he expected, there was only the whistle of a bullet passing close enough to part his hair. Hawkins cursed and worked the bolt action, but before he could fire again, a new voice cut through the chaos, familiar, impossible, and absolutely furious. You so much as scratch that boy, Bull Hawkins, and I'll put you in the ground myself. Sammy's head snapped around to see a sight that defied all logic. His father, Thomas Mac Creddy, charging through the smoke and gunfire on the back of their old plough horse, wielding a shotgun like he'd been born to it. Behind him rode Sheriff Morrison and 3 other men Sammy didn't recognize, their badges catching the electric lights from the mining operation. "Pa?" Sammy's voice came out as a croak. His father, his quiet, defeated father who never raised his voice, never fought back against anything, was leading a cavalry charge into the heart of Bull Hawkins' empire. "Federal marshals," one of the badge-wearing riders shouted. "Everyone on the ground, now!" But Hawkins wasn't surrendering. His scarred face twisted with rage as he swung his rifle toward the approaching lawmen. "This is my land, my operation. You got no jurisdiction here." "We do now," Sheriff Morrison called back, ducking as one of Hawkins' men opened fire from behind an overturned mining cart. "Got us a federal warrant based on some mighty interesting information about stolen government property and illegal mining on public land." Sammy's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed began falling into place. The mysterious riders weren't a coincidence. They were here because of him, because of something he'd set in motion without realizing it. But how? He'd told no one about his plans, shared his discoveries with no one. The answer came in a flash of understanding that hit him like lightning: the compass. Grandfather's compass pressing against his chest, warm and solid and familiar. He'd assumed it was just a keepsake, a memento of the old man's adventures. But what if it was something more? What if Grandfather, in his final moments, had found a way to leave more than just a dying message about hidden treasure? Sammy fumbled the compass from beneath his shirt, studying it in the chaotic light of muzzle flashes and electric lamps. The inscription he'd read a dozen times: "For Tommy, when the time comes to choose between gold and family." TM suddenly took on new meaning, not just a sentimental message, but instructions. A choice Grandfather had known Sammy would have to make. But there was something else, something he'd missed in his earlier examinations. The back of the compass, previously smooth, now showed faint scratches in the metal, coordinates carved in Grandfather's careful hand, so light they were almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. "Son!" His father's voice cut through his revelation. Thomas Mac Creddy had reached the paddock fence, the old plough horse lathered with sweat and blowing hard. "You hurt? You bleeding anywhere?" "I'm fine," Sammy managed, though he was anything but. Everything he thought he'd known about his family, about his grandfather, about himself, was reshaping itself in the space of heartbeats. "Pa, how did you—" "Found your room empty around midnight," his father said, checking his shotgun's loads while chaos raged around them. "Found the wire cutters missing from the barn. Didn't take a genius to figure where you'd gone." His eyes, Sammy had never noticed how hard they could be, fixed on his son with an expression of fierce love and fiercer worry. "Question is, what the hell did you think you were doing?" Before Sammy could answer, the world exploded into violence again. Hawkins, seeing his advantage slipping away as federal marshals systematically captured his men, made one last desperate play. He charged directly at the paddock fence, rifle raised, his face a mask of murderous intent. "If I can't have what's hidden in that saddle," he roared, "then nobody can." The words hit Sammy like a revelation. Hawkins knew about the treasure, had known all along, but more than that, he was willing to destroy it rather than let it slip through his fingers, which meant whatever Grandfather had hidden wasn't just valuable, it was dangerous to Hawkins personally. Sammy's hand closed around the compass as understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. The coordinates weren't marking where treasure was buried. They were marking where evidence was hidden. Evidence of Hawkins' crimes, of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many families, of the truth Grandfather had died protecting. And suddenly, Sammy understood what choice he had to make, not between safety and danger, not between family and fortune, but between the easy lie that would let Hawkins escape justice and the hard truth that might destroy everyone Sammy loved. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "The trick is living with whatever choice you make." Time seemed suspended in that heartbeat between Hawkins' charge and the inevitable collision. Sammy watched the rifle barrel swing toward him, saw the murderous intent in those brutal eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. Not fear. He'd moved beyond fear into something colder, sharper, something that felt like his grandfather's spirit settling into his bones. "Pa!" Sammy shouted, and without thinking, he hurled the compass toward his father. Thomas McCready's weathered hands, steady from years of farm work, caught it instinctively. "The coordinates on the back! Tell them about the coordinates!" Hawkins' rifle cracked, but Moonwhisper was already moving, the stallion's battle instincts taking over as he pivoted away from danger. The bullet splintered wood where they'd been standing, and suddenly Sammy wasn't just a frightened boy anymore. He was a MC Creddy riding the horse his grandfather had trained, carrying forward a legacy of courage he'd never known he possessed. "Federal Marshals!" The lead rider's voice boomed across the chaos. "William Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Thomas McCready Sr." The words hit the compound like a thunderbolt. Several of Hawkins' men threw down their weapons immediately, clearly unprepared to face federal charges. But Hawkins himself seemed to grow larger, more dangerous, fed by desperate fury. "You got nothing!" he roared, working his rifle's bolt action with practiced speed. "Old Tom died of a weak heart, and you'll never prove different." Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the gunfire. "We got his journal, Bull. Found it right where the boy's compass said we would. Every detail of your operation, every family you destroyed, every threat you made." Sammy's heart hammered against his ribs as understanding flooded through him. The coordinates hadn't marked treasure at all. They'd marked grandfather's insurance policy, hidden evidence that the old man had gathered over months, maybe years, documenting the conspiracy that was systematically destroying Millfield. His father was studying the compass, even as he kept his shotgun trained on Hawkins' men. "Sammy," Thomas called, his voice carrying a new note of respect, "your grandfather was a smarter man than any of us knew. These numbers, they're not just coordinates, they're dates, evidence, locations. He's been building a case against Hawkins since before he died." "Which is why he had to die," Hawkins snarled, abandoning any pretense of innocence. Stubborn old fool could never mind his own business, just like his grandson. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around the compound, the last of the resistance was crumbling as federal marshals overwhelmed Hawkins' remaining men. But the ranch owner himself seemed beyond caring about consequences now, his rifle swinging between Sammy and his father with the erratic movement of a cornered animal. "You want to know the truth?" Hawkins' voice carried across the paddock, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your precious grandfather came to me 3 months ago, said he knew about the mining operation, knew about the land grabbing, wanted to make a deal, his silence for protection for his family." Sammy felt the words like physical blows, but his father's voice was steady as granite. "And you killed him for it." "I offered him a partnership." Hawkins's face was twisted with rage and something that might have been grief. "Told him we could make more money in 1 year than his family had seen in 3 generations. But no, Thomas McCready was too good for that, too pure, too goddamn righteous to see opportunity when it was handed to him on a silver platter." The admission echoed across the compound, witnessed by federal marshals and recorded by the sheriff's deputy who'd been taking notes throughout the confrontation. But Hawkins seemed past caring about self-incrimination. "So yeah, I killed him," he continued, his rifle now aimed squarely at Sammy's chest. "Slipped something in his coffee during that last meeting. Made it look like his heart just gave out from the strain of losing his farm, and it would have worked too if he hadn't hidden that damned evidence where nobody could find it." Sammy's hands tightened on Moonwhisper's reins, feeling the stallion's muscles coiled beneath him like springs. Around the paddock, federal marshals were closing in, but not fast enough. Hawkins had positioned himself perfectly, one clear shot at the boy who'd brought his empire crashing down. But as Sammy stared down the rifle barrel, he wasn't thinking about death or fear or even escape. He was thinking about his grandfather's words, about choices and consequences, about the difference between what was smart and what was right. And he was thinking about the warm weight of his family's legacy pressing against his heart. Not gold or silver, but something far more valuable. The truth, the courage to speak it, and the strength that came from knowing he wasn't facing this darkness alone. "Go ahead," Sammy said quietly, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Shoot, but you'll never bury what grandfather found, and you'll never silence what he taught me." The moment stretched like a taut wire between Sammy's words and Hawkins' finger on the trigger. Then everything happened at once. "Drop the weapon!" Marshal Williams' voice cracked like a whip as federal agents materialized from 3 directions, their rifles trained on Hawkins with military precision. "You're surrounded, Hawkins. There's nowhere left to run." But Bull Hawkins wasn't looking at the marshals. His eyes remained locked on Sammy, filled with the kind of hatred that came from watching everything you'd built crumble to ash. "You think this ends it, boy? You think taking me down fixes what's broken in this world?" "Maybe not," Sammy said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "But it's a start." Hawkins' laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Your grandfather said the same thing, right before I watched the poison take hold and his eyes go glassy. He kept talking about justice, about doing what was right. Where did it get him?" The words should have shattered Sammy's resolve, should have sent him fleeing back to childhood and safety. Instead, they crystallized something hard and unbreakable in his chest. His grandfather hadn't died a victim, he'd died a warrior, fighting a battle he'd known might cost him everything. "It got him the truth," Sammy said, one hand moving to where the compass had rested against his heart. "And the truth got you caught." Hawkins' scarred face contorted with rage, but before he could pull the trigger, Moon Whisper exploded into motion. Not away from danger this time, but toward it. The stallion had sensed what Sammy intended before the boy himself fully understood. One final charge, one last desperate gamble to end this confrontation on his own terms. The Arabian's shoulder struck Hawkins like a freight train, sending the rifle spinning into the darkness. Both man and horse crashed through the paddock fence in an explosion of splintered wood and flying dirt. Sammy felt himself thrown clear, rolling hard against the barn wall as shouts erupted from every direction. When the dust settled, Hawkins was on his back with Moon Whisper standing over him, the stallion's hooves planted on either side of the rancher's chest. The horse's eyes burned with an intelligence that was almost human, as if he too understood the weight of this moment. "Easy, boy," Sammy whispered, climbing shakily to his feet. His ribs ached where he'd hit the barn wall, but nothing felt broken. "It's over now." Federal marshals swarmed the fallen rancher, snapping handcuffs around his wrists with efficient brutality. But Hawkins' eyes never left Sammy's face, even as they hauled him upright. "This won't bring him back," Hawkins said, his voice stripped of its earlier bluster. "Your grandfather's still dead. Your family's still broke. All you've done is take away the one man who might have helped you climb out of this hole." "We'll climb out ourselves," Thomas McCready said, appearing at his son's shoulder. The farmer's weathered hands were gentle as he checked Sammy for injuries, but his voice carried iron. "The way we should have all along." Sheriff Morrison approached with a leather satchel in his hands, the evidence grandfather had hidden, brought to light by coordinates carved into a compass with a dying man's determination. "Sammy, your grandfather documented everything. Bank records, forged deeds, witness statements, enough to put Hawkins away for life and return every stolen acre to its rightful owners." The boy nodded, but his attention was focused on Moon Whisper. The stallion stood quietly now, his breathing gradually returning to normal. There was something different in the horse's eyes, a peace that hadn't been there during their desperate ride to the ranch, as if he too understood that their shared burden had finally been lifted. "What happens now?" Sammy asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Some journeys changed you so fundamentally that going back was impossible. He'd started the night as a scared boy trying to save his horse. He was ending it as something else entirely. "Now we go home," his father said simply. "We bury the dead properly. We rebuild what was torn down, and we make sure this kind of evil never takes root in Millfield again. Marshal Williams approached with official papers and apologetic words about evidence and testimony, but Sammy barely heard them. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in the night wind, carrying approval and something that might have been pride. You made your choice, boy. Now you live with it. As federal agents led Hawkins toward a waiting wagon, the rancher called back one final time. Mark my words, Mac Creedy, this country's got no place for men like your grandfather anymore. No place for boys who think justice matters more than survival. You'll learn that lesson soon enough. Sammy watched the man who'd murdered his grandfather disappear into the darkness, then turned to stroke Moonwhisper's neck. The stallion nickered softly, a sound like forgiveness. Maybe, Sammy said to the night, but tonight justice won. The final confrontation was coming, not with guns and violence, but in courtrooms and communities, in the slow work of rebuilding what had been destroyed, and Sammy McCready would be ready for it. The dawn came slowly to Millfield, painting the sky the color of old blood and new hope. Sammy stood on the courthouse steps 3 weeks later, wearing his grandfather's best Sunday shirt and carrying the weight of everything he'd learned pressed against his chest like a shield. The compass was gone now, entered into evidence, along with the journal it had led them to, but its absence felt less like loss than transformation. Inside the courthouse, Bull Hawkins sat in shackles, while federal prosecutors laid out a case built on his grandfather's meticulous documentation and Sammy's own testimony. But the real test wasn't happening in that courtroom. It was happening right here, on these steps, where the entire town of Millfield had gathered to witness something none of them had expected to see, the truth. You ready for this, son? Thomas McCready's voice carried the same steady strength that had carried them through the darkest nights since the confrontation at Hawkins Ranch. His father had changed too, Sammy realized. The defeat that had weighed down his shoulders for months had been replaced by something harder, more purposeful. I think so, Sammy said, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. In a few minutes, he would walk into that courtroom and tell his story to a room full of strangers. Everything he'd discovered, everything he'd risked, everything his grandfather had died protecting. It would all come down to whether a 12-year-old boy could convince a federal judge that justice mattered more than the comfortable lies a town had been telling itself. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the courthouse, his badge catching the morning light. The lawman's face was grim but satisfied. They're ready for you, Sammy. Judge Brennan wants to hear your testimony before they bring in the other witnesses. Around them, the crowd stirred restlessly. Farmers whose land had been stolen, shopkeepers whose businesses had been driven into bankruptcy, families who'd been forced to sell everything they owned for pennies on the dollar, all of them waiting to see if a boy's courage could undo years of systematic destruction. But not everyone in the crowd was friendly. Sammy could feel hostile eyes tracking his movement, hear whispered conversations that carried threats disguised as concern. Hawkins had built his empire with the cooperation of respected citizens, and some of those citizens weren't ready to accept that their comfortable world had been built on murder and theft. That's the McCready boy, someone muttered from the back of the crowd. Damned fool's gonna destroy half the town with his wild stories. Should have minded his own business, another voice agreed. Some secrets are better left buried. Sammy's step faltered for just a moment, but then Moonwhisper's soft whinny reached him from the hitching post beside the courthouse. The stallion stood quietly in the morning sun, no longer the desperate, frightened animal they'd auctioned for $1. Like everything else in Sammy's world, the horse had been transformed by truth. They're scared, Thomas said quietly, following his son's gaze to the hostile faces in the crowd. Change always scares people, especially when it means admitting they were wrong. Grandfather wasn't scared, Sammy said, more to himself than to his father. Even when he knew it might kill him, he wasn't scared of the truth. No, Thomas agreed, he wasn't. Question is, are you? Sammy looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw something in those weathered features that he'd never noticed before. Strength. Not the loud, violent strength that Bull Hawkins had wielded like a weapon, but the quiet, enduring strength that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. I was, Sammy admitted. For a long time I was terrified of Hawkins, of losing everything, of making the wrong choice. He straightened his shoulders, feeling his grandfather's spirit settling around him like an invisible cloak. But I'm not scared anymore. The courthouse doors opened, and Marshal Williams appeared, his federal badge a symbol of authority that even Millfield's most powerful citizens couldn't ignore. "Time to go, son. The judge is waiting." Sammy nodded and started up the steps, but a voice from the crowd stopped him cold. "Boy." It was old Mrs. Patterson, the banker's widow, whose property had been among the first stolen by Hawkins' conspiracy. Her voice cracked with age and emotion. "Your grandfather would be proud." The words hit Sammy like a physical blow, but not of pain, of recognition. This was why grandfather had fought, not for treasure or revenge or even justice in the abstract, but for this moment, for the chance to stand before his community and speak truth to power, regardless of the cost. "Thank you, ma'am," Sammy said, his voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps. "I hope so." He walked through the courthouse doors with his father beside him and the weight of his grandfather's legacy pressing against his heart. Behind them, Moon Whisper watched from the hitching post, patient as sunrise, ready for whatever came next. The final test had begun. The courtroom felt smaller than Sammy had expected, but somehow more dangerous too. Judge Brennan sat behind his elevated bench like a mountain of black robes and grey whiskers, his eyes sharp as winter ice. Federal prosecutors shuffled papers at their table while Bull Hawkins slouched in the defendant's chair, his wrists still bearing the marks of federal shackles. Even in custody, the man radiated menace like heat from a forge. But it was the gallery that made Sammy's breath catch in his throat. Every seat was filled with faces he'd known his entire life, some supportive, others openly hostile, all of them waiting to see if a 12-year-old boy could hold his ground against the most powerful man Millfield had ever known. "State your name for the record," the court clerk instructed, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Samuel Thomas McCready," Sammy said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Folks call me Sammy." Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Son, do you understand the gravity of the accusations you're bringing before this court? The man you're testifying against stands accused of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. These are not charges we take lightly." "I understand, Your Honor." Sammy's hands found the edge of the witness stand, gripping the polished wood like an anchor. But my grandfather didn't die lightly either. A murmur rippled through the gallery at his words. Hawkins' lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Dallas who'd arrived on the morning train, rose from his chair with theatrical concern. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is clearly coached." "Overruled," Judge Brennan said curtly. "The boy can speak for himself. Continue, son." Sammy took a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to his boots. In the gallery, he could see his father's encouraging nod, could feel the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force. But stronger than both was the memory of his grandfather's voice, steady as bedrock. "Sometimes doing what's right costs everything you have. The question is whether you're willing to pay that price." "It started with Moon Whisper," Sammy began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Our horse. When they auctioned him off for $1, I thought it was just bad luck, thought we were poor and that's how the world worked." "But that wasn't the case, was it?" the federal prosecutor prompted gently. "No, sir. See, I followed that horse to Hawkins Ranch, and that's when I started noticing things. How every family that got foreclosed on seemed to lose their land to the same bank. How Mr. Hawkins always showed up at auctions with exactly enough money to buy what he wanted. How folks who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing or dying sudden-like." Hawkins's lawyer shot to his feet again. "Speculation and hearsay, Your Honor. This child, Judge Brennan interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of federal law, witnessed events that led to the recovery of documented evidence. I'll hear what he has to say." Sammy glanced at the defendant's table. where Bull Hawkins sat with his scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. There was no fear in those eyes, no remorse, only the cold calculation of a predator who'd been temporarily caged but not yet broken. "Tell me about the night your grandfather died," the prosecutor said softly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. In the gallery, Sammy could hear the shuffle of feet, the whisper of held breath. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the truth that had cost his grandfather's life and nearly claimed his own. "Grandfather went to meet with Mr. Hawkins," Sammy said, each word careful and precise. He'd been gathering evidence for months, documenting every illegal land grab, every forged deed. He thought maybe he could reason with him, make a deal that would protect the families being destroyed. But Hawkins had other plans, the prosecutor stated. "Yes, sir. He confessed it himself night we brought him down. Said he offered grandfather a partnership, and when that didn't work—" Sammy's voice caught for just a moment, but he forced himself to continue. He poisoned his coffee, made it look like his heart gave out from stress. The admission sent a shock through the courtroom, like lightning through water. Several people gasped audibly, while others muttered angry denials. But Hawkins himself never moved, never changed expression, as if the revelation was no more significant than commenting on the weather. "You're lying," Hawkins said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. Desperate boy making up stories to save his family's worthless farm. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "Mr. Hawkins, you will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom." But the damage was done. Sammy found himself staring directly into the eyes of his grandfather's killer, feeling the full weight of that malevolent attention like ice water in his veins. This was the moment he'd been dreading, the confrontation he'd known was coming since that first night in Hawkins' compound. "Look around this courtroom, boy," Hawkins continued, ignoring the judge's warning. "Half these people knew exactly what I was doing. They took my money, signed my papers, kept their mouths shut, because they understood how the world really works. Your grandfather was a fool who thought he could change that with righteous speeches and hidden evidence." "Maybe," Sammy said quietly. "But his evidence is what brought you down." The truth of it settled over the courtroom like dust after an explosion, heavy and inescapable. Hawkins leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the trial began, he smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made Sammy's blood run cold. "You think you've won something here, boy?" Hawkins said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned courtroom. "You think putting me in chains changes anything? There's a dozen men just like me waiting in the wings, and they'll remember what you did here today." Judge Brennan's gavel cracked again, but Hawkins wasn't finished. "Your family's marked now, Macready. Your father, your mother, that little sister of yours. You've painted targets on all their backs for the sake of Dead Man's Crusade." The words hit Sammy like physical blows. In the gallery, he saw his father's face go pale, saw the fear creeping into the eyes of neighbors who'd been nodding approval just moments before. This was the cost Hawkins had been waiting to reveal, not just the danger to Sammy himself, but to everyone he loved. "That's enough," Judge Brennan roared. But the damage was spreading through the courtroom like poison in a well. People were whispering, shifting in their seats, remembering that federal marshals wouldn't stay in Millfield forever. Sammy felt the moment slipping away, felt the courage that had carried him this far beginning to crack under the weight of what he'd unleashed. Hawkins had found his weakness, not fear for himself, but terror for his family. "Your Honor," Sammy said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos, "I'd like to make a statement." The judge studied him with those sharp eyes. "This is highly irregular." "Please." The word came out smaller than Sammy intended, but it carried something that made the entire courtroom fall silent. "There's something I need to say." Judge Brennan nodded slowly. "Proceed, son." Sammy stood up in the witness stand, feeling every eye in the room upon him. In the gallery, his father was shaking his head slightly, understanding what was coming before Sammy himself fully realized it. "Mr. Hawkins is right about one thing. Sammy began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This won't bring my grandfather back, and it might put my family in danger." He paused, meeting his father's eyes across the courtroom. "That's why I'm asking this court to accept a trade." The federal prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, the witness can't—" "Let him speak," Judge Brennan said quietly. Sammy turned to face Hawkins directly, no longer the frightened boy who'd watched his horse sold for $1. "I'll give you back the evidence. All of it. The journal, the documents, everything grandfather died protecting. I'll recant my testimony and tell this court I made it all up." Gasps echoed through the gallery. His father half rose from his seat, face stricken with understanding and loss. "In exchange," Sammy continued, his voice growing stronger, "you sign a legal document promising that you and anyone working with you will leave my family alone. Forever. You take your punishment for what the marshals caught you doing, but you leave the McCreadys out of any future plans for revenge." Hawkins' eyes glittered with something that might have been respect. "And why would I agree to that, boy? I could just wait for the appeals, work on getting this verdict overturned." "Because," Sammy interrupted, "without my testimony and grandfather's evidence, you might beat the murder charge. But I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Dallas knows exactly what kind of man you are. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure your name becomes poison in every honest town, from here to the Rio Grande." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even Judge Brennan seemed stunned by the offer, a 12-year-old boy willing to sacrifice justice for the sake of protecting his family. Hawkins studied Sammy for a long moment, and something shifted in his scarred features. "You'd really do it, wouldn't you? Throw away everything your grandfather died for? For my family?" Sammy's voice didn't waver. "Yes, sir, I would. Your Honor," the federal prosecutor said desperately, "this is completely—" But Hawkins was already shaking his head. "No deal, boy." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. "What?" Sammy blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I said no deal." Hawkins leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time since Sammy had known him, the man's expression held something other than cruelty. "Your grandfather was my enemy, but he was a worthy one. Raised himself a grandson with the same spine." He turned to Judge Brennan. "Let the boy's testimony stand. I'll take my punishment. But the threats," Sammy started, "were the desperate words of a beaten man," Hawkins said quietly. "You won, boy. Fair and square. Don't cheapen that victory by bargaining it away." In the gallery, Thomas Mack Creedy's face shone with pride and relief. Sammy had been willing to sacrifice everything, and in that willingness had somehow won everything instead. Judge Brennan stared at the exchange for several heartbeats, as if trying to convince himself that what he'd just witnessed had actually happened. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence, every person struggling to process the moment when Bull Hawkins, the most ruthless man in 3 counties, had chosen honor over opportunity. "Well," the judge said finally, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide, "I believe that concludes the witness testimony." He turned to the jury, 12 men who looked as shell-shocked as everyone else in the room. "Gentlemen, you've heard evidence of a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of this community. The defendant has, in effect, entered a plea of guilty to the charges. I trust you'll deliberate accordingly." The jury foreman, a weathered farmer from the next county over, stood slowly. "Your Honor, I don't think we need to deliberate. We find the defendant guilty on all charges." Sammy's legs gave out, and he sank back into the witness chair as the reality of it washed over him. It was over. Really, truly over. His grandfather's murder would be answered for, the stolen land would be returned to its rightful owners, and the conspiracy that had strangled Millfield for years was finally broken. But even as relief flooded through him, Sammy found his eyes drawn back to Hawkins. The man sat straighter now, accepting the jury's verdict with something that looked almost like peace. When their gazes met across the courtroom, Hawkins gave him the slightest nod, one warrior acknowledging another. "Bull Hawkins," Judge Brennan's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Jonas McCready. Additional charges will be filed as the investigation continues. The gavel fell with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Federal marshals moved to escort Hawkins away while reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Families who'd lost their farms wept with relief, while those who'd profited from the conspiracy slipped quietly toward the exits, already planning their own escapes before the investigation could reach them. Through it all, Sammy sat motionless in the witness stand, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. He'd walked into this courthouse as a scared 12-year-old boy carrying his grandfather's burden. Now, somehow, that burden had been lifted from his shoulders and transformed into something else entirely, not the weight of responsibility, but the strength of knowing he'd seen justice done. "Sammy!" His father's voice cut through the noise, gentle but urgent. Thomas McCready stood beside the witness stand, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Come on, son, let's go home." Home. The word seemed foreign after everything that had happened. Did they still have a home? Would the bank return their farm now that the conspiracy was exposed? Would Moon Whisper run free in their pastures again? As if reading his thoughts, his father smiled. "Sheriff Morrison says the court's ordering all the foreclosures reversed. Every family that lost their land gets it back, including us." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Your grandfather's journal documented everything, every forged deed, every illegal sale. We're going to get it all back, Sammy." They made their way through the crowd slowly, accepting congratulations and thanks from neighbors whose own families had been saved by Sammy's courage. Mrs. Patterson pressed a warm apple pie into his hands, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The Kowalski family, who'd lost their general store to the conspiracy, simply stood and applauded as he passed. But it was the silence from certain quarters that spoke loudest. Mayor Fitzgerald was nowhere to be seen, and neither were several other town officials whose names had appeared in his grandfather's journal. The investigation was far from over. Hawkins' empire had required many hands to build, and those hands would face their own reckonings in the days to come. Outside the courthouse, Moon Whisper waited exactly where they'd left him, patient as stone. The stallion lifted his head as Sammy approached, nickering softly in recognition. For a moment, boy and horse simply looked at each other, two survivors of a storm that had nearly destroyed them both. "We did it, boy," Sammy whispered, stroking the horse's neck. "Grandfather would be proud." As if in response, Moon Whisper nuzzled Sammy's shoulder, then turned his attention to the horizon where their farm waited. The drought was finally breaking. Real clouds were gathering in the western sky, heavy with the promise of rain. Soon, their land would be green again, their cattle healthy, their future secure. The crowd was beginning to disperse, people heading back to lives that would be forever changed by what had happened in that courtroom. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and a community was beginning the long process of healing from wounds that had festered too long in darkness. But for Sammy McCready, standing beside his grandfather's horse in the shadow of the courthouse, where he finally found his voice, the resolution felt like something else entirely, not an ending, but a beginning. The ride home stretched before them like a path through a dream. Sammy sat atop Moon Whisper, his father walking alongside on foot, both of them moving slowly through the dusty streets of Millfield, as if afraid that hurrying might somehow break the spell of their victory. The late afternoon sun slanted through the gathering clouds, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the familiar town look almost magical. As they passed the general store, Sammy noticed things he'd never seen before. Or perhaps things he'd never had the confidence to truly observe. The way Mrs. Henderson swept her front steps with deliberate care, taking pride in her small corner of the world. The gentle patience in Mr. Kowalski's voice as he helped an elderly customer count out coins for a bag of flour. The easy laughter of children playing marbles in the dust, their voices carrying the simple joy of a world made right again. "You're different," his father said quietly, glancing up at him. "In the courthouse, the way you spoke, that wasn't the same boy who used to hide behind my legs when strangers came calling." Sammy considered this, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest like a warm stone. "Guess I had to be," he said finally. "For grandfather, for Moon Whisper, for us, and for yourself," Thomas added with a knowing smile. "Don't forget that part." They turned onto the familiar dirt road that led to their farm, and Sammy's breath caught in his throat. Even from a distance, he could see that it was different somehow. Not the buildings, those were exactly as they'd left them, but the feeling of the place. The weight of desperation that had pressed down on their land like a physical force was gone, replaced by something lighter, something that felt remarkably like hope. As they drew closer, Sammy saw a familiar figure sitting on their front porch, her small hands busy with needlework. Sarah looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, her face breaking into a grin that could have powered the entire town. "Sammy!" she called out, dropping her sewing and running toward them. "Mama said you were a hero in the courthouse today." Before he could respond, she was hugging Moon Whisper's neck, pressing her face against the stallion's warm coat. The horse stood perfectly still, as if understanding that this reunion was sacred, that the little girl needed this moment of connection to believe that their world was truly safe again. Their mother appeared in the doorway, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Margaret Creedy had aged years in the past weeks, worry carving new lines around her eyes, but now those lines softened as she watched her family return home together. When her gaze met Sammy's, he saw something there he'd never quite noticed before, not just motherly love, but genuine respect for the young man he was becoming. "Come down from there and give your old mother a proper hug," she called, her voice thick with emotion. Sammy slid down from Moon Whisper's back, but his legs felt strange beneath him, stronger somehow, more certain. When he walked toward his mother, he wasn't shuffling or looking at his feet. He was walking tall, meeting her eyes, moving through the world like someone who belonged in it. The hug she wrapped him in was fierce and warm and smelled of baking bread and lavender soap, all the sense of home he'd feared he might lose forever. But when she pulled back to look at him, her expression held a mixture of joy and gentle sadness. "My little boy's grown up," she whispered, touching his face with work-roughened fingers. "I can see it in your eyes. You've seen things, done things. You're carrying yourself like a man now." "I'm still your son," Sammy said softly, suddenly understanding her sadness. The trials had changed him, yes, but they hadn't stolen away his capacity for love or his need for family. "Always," she agreed, pulling him close again. "Just more yourself than you were before, if that makes any sense." It did make sense. Standing there in his mother's arms, with his father's proud hand on his shoulder and his sister chattering excitedly about the adventures Moon Whisper must have had, Sammy realized that the boy who'd watched his horse sold for $1 was still there inside him. But that boy was no longer afraid of his own voice, no longer convinced that he was powerless against the injustices of the world. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first drops of rain began to fall. Fat, warm droplets that struck the dusty ground and released the sweet scent of earth coming back to life. Sarah laughed and spun in circles, arms outstretched to catch the precious moisture, while their parents stood together watching their children and their land receive the blessing they'd prayed for through so many desperate nights. Sammy looked up at the darkening sky, letting the rain wash the dust of the courthouse from his face, and felt his grandfather's presence like a gentle hand on his shoulder. The old man's voice seemed to whisper on the wind, "Well done, boy, well done." The rain continued to fall throughout the evening, drumming against the roof with a rhythm that sounded like applause. By morning, the parched earth had drunk deep, and small puddles reflected the clearing sky like scattered mirrors across their land. Sammy woke to the sound of his father whistling, actually whistling, as he prepared for morning chores, a sound that had been absent from their home for longer than anyone cared to remember. 6 months later, Sammy stood in that same spot where the rain had first blessed them. watching Moon Whisper graze in pastures that had grown green and lush again. The stallion's coat gleamed silver in the morning sun, no longer bearing the scars of Bull Hawkins' cruel treatment. The horse had healed, just as their family had healed, just as the entire town of Millfield had begun to heal from wounds that ran deeper than drought. The farm itself looked like something from a dream of better times. The mortgage had been forgiven entirely. Turned out the bank president himself had been part of Hawkins' conspiracy, and the federal investigation had revealed years of illegal foreclosures. Their cattle grazed in fields that stretched to the horizon, healthy and fat on grass that grew thick thanks to the rains that had returned as if summoned by justice itself. But the changes ran deeper than prosperity. When Sammy rode into town now, people didn't just nod politely, they called out greetings, asked his opinion on matters both serious and trivial. The shy boy who'd once hidden behind his father's legs was gone, replaced by a young man who could look adults in the eye and speak his mind without fear. Not because he was no longer afraid, but because he'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite the fear. "Sammy!" Sarah's voice carried across the pasture, pulling him from his thoughts. At 8 years old, she'd grown bold in the way that children do when their world feels safe again. She came running toward him, her Sunday dress already dusty from morning adventures, her face bright with the kind of joy that only comes from knowing home is truly home. "Mama says to come in for breakfast," she announced, then lowered her voice conspirationally. "And there's a letter came for you. From Austin." Sammy's heart skipped. He'd been expecting this letter for weeks, a response to his own carefully written inquiry to the State Agricultural College. His father had suggested it, pointing out that someone with Sammy's way with horses and his newfound confidence might do well studying veterinary medicine. The idea had taken root slowly, like a seed in good soil, until Sammy found himself imagining a future where he could help heal animals the way justice had helped heal their town. Inside the farmhouse, the letter waited on the kitchen table beside a plate of eggs and bacon that would have been an impossible luxury just a year ago. His mother hummed softly as she worked at the stove, occasionally glancing out the window at their reclaimed land with an expression of quiet contentment. His father sat reading a newspaper, the regional paper that had covered the trials extensively, turning Sammy into something of a folk hero across 3 counties. "Young Mac Creedy's courage saves dozens of families," his father read aloud with obvious pride. "Boy's testimony brings down corrupt empire." He looked up with twinkling eyes. "Getting tired of being famous yet, son?" Sammy grinned, settling into his chair and eyeing the letter. "Reckon I can handle a bit more attention." The words came easily now, without the stammering uncertainty that had once marked his speech. He'd learned to trust his own voice, and in doing so had discovered it was stronger than he'd ever imagined. With hands that barely trembled, he opened the envelope and read the contents twice before the words truly sank in. Accepted, full scholarship, room and board included in recognition of his exceptional character and unique background. "Well?" his mother asked, unable to hide her curiosity any longer. "They want me," he said simply, then looked around the table at the 3 faces that meant everything to him. "But not until I graduate from high school. 3 more years here first." The relief in their eyes was unmistakable. 3 more years of family dinners, of helping with farm work, of riding Moon Whisper across land that belonged to them free and clear. 3 more years of being exactly where he belonged before venturing out to build the future his grandfather's sacrifice had made possible. After breakfast, Sammy walked out to the pasture where Moon Whisper waited, patient as always. The stallion lifted his head at Sammy's approach, and for a moment they simply stood together, boy and horse, survivors and victors, living proof that sometimes the smallest voice can echo loudest when it speaks the truth. From somewhere beyond the horizon came the sound of church bells, calling the faithful of Millfield to Sunday service. Soon his family would join that gathering, taking their place among neighbors who had learned to trust again, in a town that had remembered how to hope. The beginning felt as bright as the morning sun,